All right, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for coming to our fourth webinar and final webinar of this series. The title of our conversation today is Envisioning the Future of International Justice, Transformation and Accountability. It is hosted by the Transitional Justice Institute at Ulster University in collaboration with the Unit of Global Justice at Goldsmiths University and the Emergent Justice Collective. My name is Lisa Marie Rudi, and like many of us here, but luckily not all of us, I'm a lawyer. For many years, my professional focus has been the documentation, investigation, and litigation of core international crimes, with a focus on gender-based crimes and sexual violence. I've broadened my focus a little in recent years to apply a more holistic understanding of justice and reparations. I am a founding member of the Emergent Justice Collective, International Justice Officer at Madre, and in my free time, I'm also a transformational coach. And I'm now, without further ado, I'm going to introduce our panelists, which is going to be much more interesting. And I will just be going in the order in which they're going to speak, because I could never create any hierarchy there. So our first panelist I would like to introduce is Dr. Lesley-Ann Noel. She's an assistant professor in the Department of Design Studies at North Carolina State University and co-chair of the Pluriversal Design Special Interest Group of the Design Research Society. Her research interests are emancipatory research centered around the perspective of those who would traditionally be excluded from research, community-led research, design-based learning, and design thinking. Her research also highlights the work of designers outside of Europe and North America as an act of decolonizing design. Lesley-Ann practices design through emancipatory, critical, and anti-hegemonic lenses, focusing on equity, social justice, and the experience of people who are often excluded from design research. She practices primarily in the area of social innovation, education, futures, workshops, and public health. Before joining North Carolina State University, she was the Associate Director of Design Thinking for Social Impact at Tulane University, and she was a lecturer at Stanford University and the University of the West Indies. Next up is Professor Kim Thuy Seelinger, who is an expert on sexual violence and armed conflict and forced displacement. As both a lawyer and a social scientist, Kim provides technical assistance to international and national actors working on war crimes trials, legislative reform, and support services for survivors. At the policy level, she was an inaugural member of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees Advisory Group on Gender, Forced Displacement, and Protection, and an expert commentator on the International Protocol on the documentation and investigation of sexual violence and conflict. She currently serves as a special advisor on sexual violence and conflict to the International Criminal Prosecutor. From 2010 to 2019, Kim taught at the University of California, Berkeley School of Law, where she directed the award-winning social violence program at the Human Rights Center. Currently, she's a research associate professor at the Brown School of Social Work, Public Health, and Social Policy at Washington University, where she's also visiting professor of law and director of the Center for Human Rights, Gender, and Migration. She has won several awards for her teaching and service, including a Rockefeller Bellagio residency and the Human Rights and Leadership Award from the International Association for Gender Equity and the Law. Her current work focuses on the disclosure of gender-based violence in humanitarian crisis, documenting sexual violence arising in current armed conflicts, and improving survivors' access to support services. Next up is Lorraine Smith van Lin, who is an international human rights lawyer and dedicated advocate for the rights of victims and women. In March 2021, Lorraine founded Talawa Justice for Women, a nonprofit organization dedicated to connecting, equipping, and amplifying the voices of women leaders of survivor and grassroots organizations from the Global South. She also works as an independent international human rights consultant with specific focus on victims' rights, reparations, and gender. Some of her previous roles include prosecutor and parish court judge in Jamaica, director of the International Bar Association's The Hague office, and legal advisor at Redress. Lorraine has authored numerous reports and academic articles and has been profiled by Atlas, an influential global network of international women leaders. In March 2022, she was appointed as one of the patrons of the Enforcement of the Right to Peace Global Advocacy Program. And last but not least, Dr. Valentina Azarova, who is an international legal academic and practitioner working at the intersection of power, law, and violence. Her current research concerns the world-making role of accountability practices and justice agendas of human rights actors and the legal reproduction of violence through the laws on irresponsibility and complicity in the context of transnational dealings. Her practice follows the trauma-informed and counter-hegemonic approach and is centered around movement lawyering. She has advised liberation and social movements, NGOs, international organizations, and governments since 2005, and co-created and taught international law and legal practice since 2009, including in Palestine, Lebanon, and Turkey. Valentina has over a decade of experience co-creating and teaching law and practice. She currently teaches practice at Swansea University Law School, Grenoble Alpes University's Human Rights Clinic, and is a research fellow at the Manchester International Law Centre. Valentina is a founding member of the Global Legal Action Network, GLAN, where she co-leads projects on border violence, the arms trade, and global value chains. She's also a founding member of the Emergent Justice Collective. Okay, I want us to take a collective breath and just let all of that sink in. All of these amazing folks we have here today to talk about the future of intersectionality and international justice. So as many of you know, we had 3 webinars so far. This is the 4th one. And while the previous ones have focused a bit more on what it concretely means to apply an intersectional approach in the that we live in today, we today have the beautiful task of envisioning a different future and the freedom of dreaming of new generative systems that have intersectionality woven into their DNA. Underpinning the application of intersectionality lies a vision of complementary paths of accountability, so various ways in which justice can be achieved and different processes that can represent a form of justice for different people. Operationalizing intersectionality demands a structural reform within the justice system itself, and we will have a conversation today about what that could look like. I would like to invite the panelists as well as the audience to be open to a conversation today that is maybe a bit unlike what we might be used to. We're here to talk about things that might be concrete at the same time as they might be somewhat aloof and visionary. The international justice system that we operate in is still young, and it is good for us to remember that we're still in the process of designing the system. We're shaping it as we operate within it. And this conversation today will be a reminder for us to stay bold, stay innovative, and not stuck in our ways, and to keep intersectionality as our North Star and the one thing that will be woven into everything we do. We're not here to come up with answers, but simply to hold space for an hour and a half in which we can dream of what kinds of system we want to design going forward. We could throw ideas around and come out of this conversation with some new food for thought and impetus for further discussion. I hope that the conversation is going to demonstrate what an intersectional approach to justice looks like, multi-layered, multifaceted, and not linear. And we have a very interdisciplinary group of people here demonstrating just how important it is that we step out of our silos as we attempt to co-create an intersectional future. Before I jump into the logistics of today, I just want to acknowledge also that there's a lot going on right now in the world. We have a Russian invasion of Ukraine. We have several other ongoing conflicts in the world. We have witnessed structural racism and discrimination at borders. Many of us work in ongoing emergency settings and are currently fighting to get people out of situations of extreme vulnerability. So I just want to name that some of us might be feeling a little heavy, and practicing an intersectional approach also means that we don't have to leave these parts of us at the door, at our virtual Zoom door, but we can bring whatever we're experiencing into the space and make room for it as much as we want to, and know that this is a place of support. So I just wanted to name that. And then before I will finally stop talking, I just want to say that we will have about half an hour at the end for questions and answer. Please put your questions into the Q&A box. Closed captions are available at the bottom of your screen on the right. If you click on live transcript, this session is being recorded. You can watch it later on our YouTube channel. And if you want to engage in this discussion on Twitter, please, well, you can if you want to use the hashtag #IntersectionICL. So now I will finally let our panelists speak, and I will just hand it over to Lesley-Ann, and let's ask ourselves today, what would the world look like if we got to freely envision the future of international justice without any constraints?
Thank you, Lisa Marie. And so I don't know if I'm directly going to answer that big question, right? I just prepared like a little thing about how did I even get invited to this conversation? So for people on the call, I'm a designer, I'm a professor in design. I've been kind of like inching into these conversations about law and restorative practices and conversations that I'm not, maybe I would never have imagined that I would have been in 10 years ago. So I guess, maybe how did I get here? How did I get this invitation? So I've been talking about positionality in design practice for a little while. I'm in the field of design where we have, more recently, I suppose, in design practice, we've been hiding our subjectivity. As designers, well, I studied in the 90s, and certainly in the 80s and the 90s, designers were much clearer about being subjective about their work, that, okay, I chose blue because I wanted to, right? And now in more recent design practice, we've been trying to do work that's a little bit more anonymous and, kind of evidence-based and things like that. But I had been questioning design practice and the way that we do things as designers for a little while, and then did graduate studies that brought me into qualitative research more formally. And that's where I learned about having to declare one's positionality, which is tied to intersectionality, as we did our work, right? So my PhD research was about design with children. And as I designed my research, I had to write this very long positionality statement that would help me uncover my own issues and agendas in the work that I was doing that I couldn't actually see. So after I wrote the positionality statement, I was able to see, oh, I'm a mother, and that has an agenda in the kind of curriculum that I want to create. I've been teaching for a very long time. So that, again, there was an agenda there that I was trying to bring into the work. And, as I wrote this thing, I was able to see these agendas a little bit more clearly. And I started to wonder, well, why aren't we doing this in design? Because actually, in the work that we do as designers, we do bring our positionality in. And even if we're trying to do work that is objective. And so I started to create tools around bringing the positionality into the design studio to intentionally create space for people to talk about their identities, right? So I have one tool called the positionality wheel, which helps people, it's actually a circle, and it helps people to think about 12 elements of their identity and then discuss it, either reflect on it individually or discuss it as a group. And then another anecdote that I'll share with you is that, in California, so I've actually taught in 4 universities in my life, right? And spent some time in California at one university. And it was when then I was removed from my original context in Trinidad and Tobago, and from the East Coast of North America, I saw how a prompt that I would normally use could go completely off. I sent students off to do some research and asked them to interview people that they knew and bring those conversations back to the classroom. And everybody interviewed people who were variations of the same person, which I had never seen before because I was accustomed to teaching in much more diverse spaces. And so then the second tool that more directly deals with intersectionality that I created, let me see, I think I have it next to me somewhere. It's the Designer's Critical Alphabet. It's a series of cards where I was trying to bring in conversations about identity and conversations about intersectionality into the design studio in a more playful way. So I actually created these 3 cards, one about critical race theory, another one about feminist theory. These don't sound fun. And then the third one about through the eyes of the child, where I wanted students to see the perspectives that were not in the design studio and see how we were bringing these voices in. So, you know, I gamified that a bit, and then they had to flip a card and then change the perspective of their research and the perspective of the products that they were designing to match the point of view of these people who were not represented in the room. So the thing is, our positionality changes how we do design, right? It changes how we view issues, how we view other people. It even changes the way that we collaborate and work and how we do our work as designers, right? My positionality manifests itself in my design practice, the tools and methods that I create to bring critical perspectives into the design studio, my own interest in emancipation and engagement techniques, including futurism. So I've also been trying to lean more explicitly into my positionality and that of collaborators as we examine design issues and design processes. You know, and as part of this exploration, I've also been moving to more radical design principles and design frames, you know, wondering how can our positionality create new design principles, such as, for example, abolition as a design principle. We've been talking about this quite a lot in the classes that I teach. You know, what were the abolitionists, the people who committed to ending slavery, what were they thinking of? And how can we as people who are designing new systems draw on that kind of influence in the work that we are doing, so that we're not just promoting tiny changes? You know, how can we be much more radical? How can we be inspired by emancipatory research so that we are not creating anything without the people who are impacted by the research, you know, and this probably can apply to people in policy as well. How can we be really decolonial in the work that we do, and how can we consider things like epistemic injustice? You know, some of us in this world, the minute we open our mouth because we have an accent from wherever, we are going to face certain kinds of barriers, you know, so how can we use that as we design new things and new futures, right? So let me see, I'm probably running out of time. I want to highlight, you know, I really want to shout out another lawyer who I know, Margaret Rose Goddard and the Future Law Collaborative, who have intentionally created space for me to have conversations with lawyers who are thinking about the future. You know, and we've had conversations about design, equity, these radical design principles. So they've given me their feedback on abolition and equity, and even radical versus incremental change, right? We did an entire design workshop about co-designing equitable futures and how can we bring design into policy. And, you know, what is it that designers could bring to this kind of conversation, right? And so maybe that could bring me back to the positionality, intersectionality, and international justice, you know, the invitation that you made, right? So, you know, even though we may think that the law is blind, and in design, we might think that design is agnostic, the reality is that we have to see people and their identity, since that affects the things that they do, the things that they make, the ways that they work, you know, and the ways that they communicate with each other, you know. And so some principles for policy that design could offer to the discussion include co-design principles, you know, the way that we have to create spaces to get people to collaborate on things. What else could we, you know, that we design policy with people and not merely for them. In design, we prototype things and we put things out before they're completely perfect. So, you know, in design practice, we can work very quickly and try to get feedback immediately. And maybe that we could also bring into the conversation. And then design has this quality of future building and world making and, you know, visionary, creating playful spaces for new visions. And so that may be another thing that we could bring to this conversation, right? So I guess I'm going to pause here and see if we could, I'll pass it over to the next person. Yes. Over to you, Lisa Marie.
That was I have so many questions for you. Does anybody want to jump in? Otherwise, yeah, go ahead, Kim.
I was just thinking, thanks for that, Lesley-Ann. I was just trying to think really concretely, just taking all the wisdom that you were presenting and thinking about my own experience working with survivors of violence, right? And how important space is, right? And often we're just working with the space we have and we've sort of had to figure it out. But in truth, like when there were so many times where when I would have someone in my office to interview them, not only are they a survivor of violence, obviously, which is why they're coming to me, but they may also be a mother with a young child they're carrying around. And I didn't have space, right, to keep the child separate from the conversation the mother wanted to have with me. She's not going to discuss violence she's experienced while the child's in the room, and yet she didn't want the child to be out of view, right? And so I always had this fantasy that I would have a little playroom built onto my office with glass there, and I had a colleague who could go in and, you know, create more space for the people that we're working with and purporting to serve to actually be able to come freely and speak freely and also not worry that the child's being removed. So you can be a survivor of violence and also a mother who's terrified of losing sight of her child but can't speak. You know, little things like that. I was thinking about how important the space is, even at a really micro level, right? Can my room be bright enough that it's not intimidating and yet not have the windows make someone feel exposed to the outside street, right? And so just a lot of this, and much of it does play on the intersectional, you know, nature of the folks who come before us. They have very many different reasons. Can I put an LGBTQI, like a rainbow flag behind my desk just in case, like that brings comfort or puts someone more at ease? And anyway, so thanks for your thoughts, but I was just, it really drove me to some really concrete reflections, I think, on my own space.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I wanted to jump in here as well, just to add to that conversation. I mean, I agree with Kim, and, you know, Lesley, you've made me start thinking about a couple of things. When we talk about space, what does space really even mean? Like, for example, when you're in the field, I remember we were in Uganda doing a focus group discussion, and we planned a lovely community center. It was beautiful, but for the people, being in that sort of box was also very restrictive. So we had to move the entire thing outside under a very large mango tree. And then you got people opening up. And so again, it kind of makes me think about what Kim says, like, how flexible are we when we're talking about designing spaces? Who designs these spaces? You know, and are these persons also taking an intersectional approach? When we think about the future, do we also think about designers taking an intersectional approach? But yeah, so you're sparking a lot of questions. How far back do we go? Do we only talk to lawyers and so on, or do we talk to the architects who are designing courtrooms as well? So.
Yeah, one thing I've been asking in this way that I teach design, you know, design is in fact very Eurocentric. You know, you don't go through a design program without talking about the Bauhaus or, you know, in Germany or, you know, but so I collaborate a lot with people in Brazil and South Africa in particular. I don't know how come, this is where my professional networks, you know, this is where they are. And so we ask these questions, right? Okay, so is what we do in the Caribbean, in South Africa, in Brazil, is it design if we don't talk about the Bauhaus, right? Or if we don't talk about, you know, when we remove the Eurocentrism, is what we're doing still design? And then the other question that we look at, is there a way, so this is back to intersectionality that might apply to you as lawyers, is there a way that we practice differently if, again, we lean into our own positionalities, right? I'll remove the design reference and put in the lawyer. Does the lawyer from Trinidad or the lawyer from Johannesburg practice law in a different way because of their identity as a person from these places, as, you know, because of their gender, because of their parenthood status? Does that in fact impact the way that they work. It may not, because I know the law is supposed to be blind, but you know, that's the question that I would have for you. I'm sure it does.
Yeah, and I think that's such a good question. Does it impact, but do we even, like both of these things you just said, they link together, because do we even have the space in our systems to ask the question, how does the identity affect what you're doing? Because a lot of the time, even in the way we design our projects or our timelines, our reporting timelines, there is not a moment to pause and reflect on the positionality. But I will hand it over to Kim now to give her the floor.
Okay, great, thanks. And I apologize if in the middle of talking, I have to walk over to the electric socket because I think my laptop is about to die. I'm gonna follow Lesley-Ann with just actually, I'm not sure if all of our participants have seen all the webinars at all, but I thought, if it's okay, Lisa, I wanted to start with just touching back on the origins of the intersectionality concept, just to begin with, because I think for me that was helpful to ground what my dreaming of how we expanded from here for international criminal law. And we know, right, that Kimberly Crenshaw sort of presented this concept back in her 1989 essay on demarginalizing the intersection of race and sex. And she was, of course, very much focused on the fact that despite the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, racism was still alive and well and permeated multiple aspects of Black Americans' lives in the US. And she was critiquing the rigidity of our laws here in the US and the tendency of our courts to demand that discrimination or bias claims be brought either on grounds of gender or race, but not at the same time, when in truth, as we know, the whole is always greater than the sum of its parts, right? And specifically, you know, the frame she was using was of Black women in the US and how they experience specific kinds of discrimination because they're both Black and women, and severing that experience into one or the other claim would not fully capture the injustice nor provide the remedy. But you know, it's been pretty cool to see Crenshaw herself marvel at how that concept is sort of busted out of its original context, which is why I'm so excited about the initiative your generation of women lawyers has really sort of put on the table for us all to think about. So when we invoke it now in this conversation and elsewhere, we're no longer talking, obviously, about the way race and discrimination in the US compounds with other forms of discrimination, race discrimination, but we're invoking it because it's become synonymous with an awareness of complexity and the commitment to addressing multiple vulnerabilities, needs, or identities. And we're using it to express acknowledgement that, again, that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So when I remind myself about that, then it becomes actually really exciting to dream about what an intersectional approach to the future of ICL could be. And from what I've read of her, Kimberly Crenshaw doesn't mind or wouldn't mind our evolving concept in this space. And I hope you can report back to her one day to tell her how it's taken root in this other field. So what would it look like for us, and how big can we dare to dream? I had three initial thoughts, and they're all still pretty rough, so I apologize. But my first thought is closest to Crenshaw's original concept, and that's the acknowledgement of the intersectional identities of the folks before us, right? So obviously, on the most immediate level, and I think Lorraine will touch on this when she talks about integration of survivors into the conversation, we at a minimum need every actor in our system to understand and respond to the intersectional vulnerabilities and identities of the victims, witnesses, and even perpetrators who come through this system or these different justice systems. So of course, you know, when we look at crimes coming out of the 36-year civil conflict in Guatemala, for example, can we see the specific fullness of an indigenous woman's experience, capture that with appropriate charging, right? That requires more than just a gender analysis. That requires a pretty broad spectrum analysis of all vulnerabilities there, right? We're not even doing a full gender analysis in most cases, but we have to be more ambitious than that and have more guidance about how to do that. And also, you know, when we have a defendant who committed horrendous atrocities, but who was also abducted as a 13-year-old and indoctrinated and even rewired cognitively to fight, thanks to a constant stream of drugs and alcohol, like, do we know how to approach his culpability, for example? So I think one reminder to myself is, you know, intersectionality applies also to the experiences of perpetrators, actually. And the better we understand the complexities of where they're coming from and what their formative years even were, then I think we can have a better approach to understanding their own culpability and also what the appropriate defenses or sentencing considerations might be. Right? But then also, my second thought then is to look at ourselves, right? And think about the modalities of developing an intersectional understanding in the way we work as individuals and institutions. So can we be intersectional in how we approach the work? So I want to see us make room in the courtroom and even before the courtroom. So it's not just judges and lawyers who populate that space and dictate our understanding and how we work, but also so we have social workers and psychologists and historians and political scientists and anthropologists on the team from the beginning to help us make sense of the files in front of us, the processes that we use. And that's not just having them parachute in as expert witnesses, right? But really have them as full members of the team, right? Guiding investigations, guiding prosecution, guiding judgment even. So I think that would enrich our understanding of conflicts. It would enrich our understanding of the nature of the violence, the impacts of violence, the cultural and historical significance of what we see before us. And I know that we do that to some degree now, but I really hope that we can build sort of a more intersectional approach to our understanding of the work and the files in front of us. I think we have to have these multiple lenses in order to understand the work, to do it, and how we got here to begin with. And I think the last sub-point under this second idea was, it harkens back to what you mentioned earlier, Lisa Marie, and that is to add the notion and really prioritize self-care among practitioners in this work, which I think is our own intersectional issue, right? Like we are, many of us doing this work, we're lawyers, we have certain skills and mindsets, but we also are humans, and we also can be deeply affected by the work that we do day in and day out, and to have longevity in the work, to avoid becoming jaded, cynical, and to really remain open and I think truly receptive to the work in front of us. We do have to take care of ourselves, and that's something we don't do very well, and we really should be finding a way to do that more institutionally. And then finally, the third point is just to look at the project of global justice generally. How do we develop an intersectional approach to how these cases are built and handled at all? I've been thinking a lot about how the frequent dynamic between actors in the global north and the global south, and how they feed into different parts of these cases. Can we envision a way where there's truer integration and partnership? We see some very good examples, right? I'm thinking about the really interesting and holistic and north-south work in the Kavumu case in Eastern DRC, where you had civil society groups like Physicians for Human Rights and Trial really working with the local Panzi hospital team in Bukavu to bring this case and collaborate on survivor care, evidence collection, everything. And that was, I think, a great partnership. I'm also thinking, I'm a little biased here, and Lisa Marie knows, but the work of Civitas Maxima and the Global Justice and Research Project in Liberia, and how local Liberian human rights defenders can build those cases, and then a Swiss-based group can help package those cases and present them to federal authorities for potential uptake through universal jurisdiction. These are great efforts at North-South partnership, but they're not perfect, and then they need to be built upon and expanded in a way that brings true parity and true partnership and full exchange for folks, no matter where they're sitting and no matter where the court sits. So I won't go into massive detail there, but I've been really trying to think about how can we build like real integration of expertise, because it's without sort of fully, I think, fully embedded expertise from folks who are on the ground, from communities that were affected, we can't possibly understand the full nature of the violence or the full priorities for justice of the survivors and the communities we purport to serve in our grand justice system. So really wanted to think about how to include that expertise more fully, and whether that's through real training and time spent in both places together, or some other modality. And the only thing I would add there too is there are other groups locally who I think are not necessarily visible and who could play a real important role. Like, we don't ever consult with the youth, right? Who are affected by conflict, have a stake in the outcome of justice, and really should be at the table, at least advising about how we approach the cases. So I'll stop there. And I know that's not the type of intersectionality that Crenshaw had in mind, but I think we, if we're trying to figure out how to use the term fully in our work, I wanted to.
I love how everybody has said so far fits so well together, because then what you said, Kim, makes me want to go back to Lesley-Ann and talk about positionality when we're building partnerships. But yeah, I will just open the floor to anyone who would like to say anything, or otherwise I can hand it over to Lorraine. Thank you.
I was actually thinking
Yes.
about, as Kim was talking, I actually made a note here about taking care to craft collaborations, building on the intersectionalities and specificities of the relationships involved, or the identities, or paying attention to gender, epistemologies, age, I think it is a challenge, and it's an interesting challenge about how are we actually going to build context-specific work when we are maybe sold more on doing work that's less context specific. I don't know if that makes sense. We're, because we are taught more about objectivity and being agnostic and things like that, it's easy to forget how important the context is, and all of these players, how you need to craft an experience specific to the people that you're working with to get to the best outcomes. So I think that's, again, as you spoke, I thought as a designer, how could we be co-designing, for example, investigations with the different players or actors, within the work that you're describing. And I mean, I'm outside, but I'm still trying to think, okay, well, maybe there is a way to build these partnerships much more intentionally so that people also feel seen, and so that their voices can be heard as part of the process.
Lorraine, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, actually, it's an excellent segue into what I'm planning to say, because these are some of the questions that I'll be raising. I mean, I do want to play a little bit the devil's advocate here as well, in terms of just the assumptions that we ourselves have made. I kind of went and looked back at the previous panels, and it was very interesting to see and to hear the perspectives of the different panelists. But there was, in some ways, an assumption that there is an acceptance, in some ways, that intersectionality is the right way forward. And I'm going to play the devil's advocate here and say, what if that is thrown in the mix by persons who may not necessarily feel that an intersectional approach is a good fit in the international justice framework. So I want to park that there as an idea while I think about some of what Lesley-Ann has said, and Kim, because it links very closely to what I kind of also want to say in terms of how we are to envision the future. But I'll get back to that answer because it's wrapped up in my intervention. So I'll just start at the beginning, if I could, Lisa. In terms of just, as I said, going back, like pedaling back to a couple of the sessions, and this is also shamelessly advertising the other 2 panels, the other 3, I think only 2 are online right now, you know, where there were excellent interventions around the issue of intersectionality, and a lot of them came from practitioners, people who are investigators or, you know, former investigators or current, as well as prosecutors. And people who are in civil society actors. And I think what I saw from those interventions was this sort of multi-dimensional nature of this concept of intersectionality and how it links to ICL, because it made me realize that we are talking about many, many different actors who are coming at this from very different angles, even in terms of how we engage with victims and affected communities. So, you know, civil society actors have a particular mandate when they are approaching affected communities and they're working directly with victim populations. And it does not always dovetail with what investigators and prosecutors have as their priorities. And so my issue as well, which is why I'm also partially playing devil's advocate, is how do we ensure that narratives around intersectionality doesn't lose sight of the fact that there are even intersectional approaches in relation to the actors who are part of this. It's not just in relation to the population that we're trying to serve, but those who are working directly with those populations. And then another issue that came up was the question of the purpose of international criminal justice. So then there was this issue of the interplay between formal justice processes and informal or other justice processes or hybrid processes, and how does intersectionality as a concept fit into those boxes. And my look at everything, I found some very, very useful things that I think would add value to even this discussion. So I want to take and borrow from and stand on the shoulders of persons like Max Marcus and Valerie and Patricia Sellers and all who went in previous seminars and pull out some of the things that they highlighted, which I think are really relevant here. And one of them is the importance of framing. Not just framing the charges in a formal system, but framing in terms of just our understanding of intersectionality, framing, you know, what does it mean and to whom? And then to something that Max said, which I thought was really significant, is how do we ensure that there isn't this, it doesn't become this, international justice is not this exclusive club in a way. Those weren't her words, those are mine, but how do we ensure inclusivity? And as I thought through some of what she said, one thing really stood out to me, and that is the importance of engagement. And in my view, that's the way forward. Engagement, collaborative engagement with affected populations, and engagement with multidisciplinary actors from different perspectives, I think will help us to come to an approach that works. And I don't know whether that will be immediate because it's a process and it will take some time, but engagement and consultative engagement. And I decided to use an acronym which we have coined in Talawa in terms of in our work and training. And it's something that I think I came up with because 2021 was one of those years that required me to pivot. It's really an acronym. And pivot is an acronym for, the P is for planning. So plan. And this acronym, I came up with pivot because of trying to find a way to engage with women leaders, women survivor leaders. How could I engage with them without imposing on them, without sort of taking over and imposing my views of leadership on them? And I sat down and thought about intersectionality as a concept and how it fits with international justice. And I realized we have to do the very same thing. We literally have to pivot. Pivot, when we say planning, and we could replace the P with positionality, we need to, I use plan. And for me, planning it's a structural thing. How do we look at and change structures to ensure that victims are not just people on paper? We know the ICC has, victim-centric provisions. We know that. We know that the Office of the Prosecutor has very detailed policy papers that even address the issue of intersectionality. But how do we ensure that these structures don't just remain, and these systems and policies and so on are not just things that are on paper? How do we make sure that these actually are implemented in practice? Well, the I tells us how. Innovate. The I in pivot is about innovation. And this is why having Lesley-Ann here is amazing, because what does innovation mean in this context? To me, innovation really talks about looking at how we're going to use what we have, but probably using it differently to how we've been using it now. So innovation for me and intersectionality means coming up with new and different ways to approach outreach to affected communities, for example. It might mean meeting with them in different settings. It might mean canvassing their views in different ways. And for example, one of the things that we've looked at, it's not an innovative concept, but it's a great concept, and I don't want to take any more time, but the phenomenological approach to evaluation, hearing from victims what their lived experiences are. Can we bring that into our understanding and investigation of crimes? I'll go quickly because of time with the VOT, but the V is visualize, and the O is operationalize. The T is train. And I just want to throw pivot out there, and I can go into a little bit more detail, but I know we are a bit over time. But I wanted to stress the operationalize aspect of it, because I can say that from what I've seen from some of the other panelists, operationalizing this is not going to be as simple as it may seem. The fact is, courts like the ICC are dependent on budget states to pay for these budgets. And I, as somebody from the outside, I have grand visions of wonderful outreach meetings and so on with victims, and charges that are all inclusive. It's not going to happen. So although I would love to see international justice pivot in that way, I'm not sure that realistically we're going to see it. So that's my 2 cents, that although I'm envisioning a great and wonderful future, I'm still to be convinced as to whether or not we are at that place where we can truly pivot and incorporate intersectional analysis fully into ICL.
I just wanted to not jump on, Lorraine, just really respond to something you just said right now, which is so interesting. And I think there is so much space besides the ICC, right? And I say that knowing that I am fully engaged with the ICC at this point, but so much of the really creative work is happening with civil society organizations who derive their funding from private foundations. So I mean, thanks for raising it, because I meant to raise this earlier in my comments too. As with everything, like really pushing funders and donors to understand the value of this approach. And I think that's an easier sell right now with a lot of the private foundations that support the civil society work and in global justice. And it might be that if they can be convinced and we see new, real inclusive practices happening in the civil society space, maybe that will actually influence the way our tribunals, the actual tribunals that are more maybe conservatively funded by donor states would then develop. So I hear you. I totally agree. I do feel a little optimistic that the NGOs and the civil society groups have a little more potential to push the envelope of intersectionality and lead the way actually for some of the other structures. That's my hope.
So like I didn't really talk about like speculation and futuring. And that's an area of design that I have a toe in, where speculative design practice actually is not about making things that work. It is about making things that are a critique of structures and organizations, and and then maybe the speculative designer isn't trying to push the work necessarily further, but maybe other people will pick up that work and continue moving with it. So I think like when I think of impossible design principles, like this one that I'm interested in these days, the abolition, I'm like, okay, well, how can we really use that? It's not necessarily that you want to get the answer. So, like what we're saying about, okay, maybe the intersectional framework isn't actually practical today, but if we take it as a principle, it will help move the conversation further on, right? And so we try something, we take it as a grounding principle, and we see how far that can push us. And then if it's not the principle, then but maybe at least it's going to guide us to the next thing, And so like I'm just sharing that from the world of design, the speculative design or design futures is a real area of work where we're not trying to make concrete things. We're just trying to push ideas forward, and maybe there could be a role for something like that in this ICL space that we're in.
Absolutely. And that's why I wanted to play the devil's advocate in this session, because I know that, there is a lot of pushback. There is a lot of pushback about whether ICL and intersectionality can even be in the same space or discussion. And I do think there is space. And what I hope comes out of this is that, donors and those funding courts put their money where their mouth is, that this is not just a sort of esoteric discussion. In order to operationalize this, it has to be funded, it has to be supported, and it's worth the investment. I saw that in the chat, I think, or was it Kim, you said that, it is worth the investment of both time and money.
And I think also one thing that came up during the last webinar was kind of this question around staffing, and Angela shared some statistics from the independent expert review of the ICC, and sort of saying that there's still a long way to go to have true representation on the staff, and I don't remember who it was, but somebody also said, well, the thing is that the people who are going to want to apply an intersectional approach, they're going to leave. They're not going to stay in these spaces because they're going to get frustrated. And I think what I'm also hearing now here is that it doesn't all have to be in these structures that we know. It can be in structures that we invent now, or it can be in grassroots initiatives that are just coming into being, or maybe that are already existing for a very long time, but there's no attention on them for now. But we're practicing what we are doing here now in this conversation. We're practicing intersectionality, and we're just trying it out in these new spaces, and we're building new spaces. And we don't have to always, of course, incremental change, going back to what Lesley-Ann was also saying, incremental change is a way there, but we can also just practice the future outside of the existing structures. And now I will hand it to Valentina, because we haven't heard from her yet, and I really want to hear her thoughts.
Hi everyone. Thank you so much for sharing this space and for the invitation. I also feel like I'm happily listening and observing and soaking in, but I also feel like the other side of the sandwich, perhaps, in terms of being a bystander. In observing the operation of the so-called recognized, established, institutionalized forms of international justice, which often have the word criminal between the words international and justice. And that has, for a very long time, most of the time that I've spent perhaps uncritically contributing to some of these processes, I've been very uneasy with the laws and underlying sort of background conditions, legally speaking, that produce knowledge through these frameworks, through these processes. So it's really not my intention or my authentic place here to offer a detailed critique of international criminal law as a space, but I thought embrace the invitation nonetheless, offer some soul searching and unthinking sort of impulses or intuitions, and see where that takes the conversation. So I'm thinking of sharing some thoughts, basically both on the limits and pitfalls of international criminal justice in this very officialized form. And there's a lot there, so I will just throw some things up, and maybe some of them will stick and be interesting for us to elaborate on. And then also try to share some, basically quite a laundry list of intuitions around rethinking accountability and what ways accountability and justice could be transformed in and of itself to serve life better. And of course, so I've been thinking about these things from the perspective of someone who spent some 15 years in international legal practice around Palestine, particularly, as well as other situations of conflict, armed conflict, as structural violence processes. But also someone who is positionality-wise part of a category of so-called victims of enforced disappearance, and also someone who's just sitting here with a heavy heart of experiencing the ongoing violence in Ukraine as a post-Soviet Ukrainian myself. So just taking that particular vantage point and situation as an example of so much, given that it's really one of the most all-out responses from an international community perspective that we've seen by some accounts since apartheid South Africa. And yet, the kind of forms of solidarity, if we could even use that word, or responses rather, that we're seeing being preferenced by international law, by laws that are really worthy of the name, laws of violence, are conflict management responses, coupled with a preoccupation with the legitimacy of violence, legality of violence, but also the unfortunate escalation of violence through supposed defensive arms supplies that some have almost cynically called arming peace, some politicians. And then also coupled with the very punitive, collectively punitive in many ways of the Russian population, in terms of sanctions. So with that heavy heart, I sort of wonder around what international law really offers us by way of serving our need of responsibility as the ability to respond to these types of situations. And so how that terrain sort of in a much more foundational way and fundamental way needs to be unthought and reimagined to further really transformative accountability that also accounts for some of the harm that I think you can hear in my voice that we experience both of this, particularly I think as legal practitioners, the helplessness around these realities. So first set of remarks, as we all know well, criminal justice processes are rather preoccupied with the production of knowledge about causal and intentional contributions of specific individuals to harm, so with a view to punishment and sort of a logic of deterrence. And I think for me, to cut a very long story short, and for many others, right, I think many others, criminal processes at the international level, I think much legacies in the thinking in this area domestic, but at the international level, at best fail to comprehend, let alone recognize certain forms of structural violence and structural complicity, and certainly at worst occlude and obscure and invisibilize certain forms of violence and realities. Be it the lack of historicity, the lack of ability to really capture certain frames. And again, I speak to contexts that I've been involved in, and in a sense, it's also an invitation to hear the opposite, really, if we can imagine the opposite, because I do try to be an optimist about our ability to make incremental change, even though I sense Lesley-Ann's response on this will be that there are moments when we also need to recognize the necessity of going far beyond that. And I would love us to try to think together around whether that's where we are, and if so, in relation to what more granularly. I like the work of Marion Young, who's a philosopher and social critic, who's looked at the particular liability model that criminal justice process accountability processes are fixated on, again, from a knowledge production perspective. And of course, coming to intersectionality with that more holistic, sort of broader, deeper, fuller account that Kim referenced earlier, rather than the one that reimagines itself perhaps and sort of feeds on reality in more authentic ways, but one that embraces complexity and centers knowing as kind of the beginning of any process of reckoning and rupture. So it's this model of liability that, of course, focuses on personification of perpetrators that's misdirected when we apply it to the background conditions beyond the reach of any individual. And there's a lot more that Marion Young and many others have said on this. But essentially, it ignores the fact that individuals in these positions lack realistic alternatives and are forced by certain circumstances. So again, it really comes up against transformation as a real purpose and drive behind such processes. And that is certainly, to me, quite fundamentally. I think criminal processes are also problematic because they, and again, there's a lot of experience here, they're fixated on what we can't let go of, which is innocence, right? The blame games around this create a narrative in which some are guilty and others are then exonerated necessarily by default, right? And that also includes usually the systems and the background conditions that are neither treated nor understood, nor recognized, nor adjudicated, perhaps. So these legal fixes are part of the problem that then legitimizes, essentially. The system allows itself to go on through those rotten apple scenarios and those labeling moves. So I think, I mean, there's much more there, but I'll wrap that up by saying this kind of form of solutionism through criminal justice, through personification and punishment, essentially, to me, responds with violence. Responds to violence with violence, right? And so it's a different, slow, institutionalized, epistemic kind of violence, but it is one that rejects complexity, promotes a certain set of liberal values as well, which, of course, legitimize militarism, legitimize sort of marginalization of certain political left voices, let alone many, many others. And so where, if we cross that and want to rethink, there's a world of intuitions, of course, that I would love to throw up some ideas from, and that I have spent some years now also trying to shift my thinking and practice in the direction of this kind of pluriversity towards international justice work that takes seriously a core commitment to a form of intersectionality, if we want, this method, this process, but essentially this fuller, deeper form of knowing. So for me, I think these are just some final remarks. Let me just pick from this long list of what grounding and centering those types of justice and accountability processes that affirm life, that really are centered around basic human needs, much more even than human rights. Needs including recognition, shared reality, community participation, belonging, freedom, and so forth, that necessitate transformation and redistribution, of course, goes without saying. So So here are a few ideas, and I think, and intuitions, and this draws on a lot of literature. But by thinking accountability as an act of love and care, Kazu Haga remarks that accountability is not something we can shove down someone's throat, but rather something that, rather a way of creating beloved community by building understanding. For Ceppo Madlingozi, the responsibility to the story of those involved in accompanying and animating justice processes should entail redistribution of power and resources, very much a feminist approach. Relatedly, how could these processes better align with nonviolence thinking and praxis, including the critical theory, Butler's, they're included, focusing on building people, not destroying them, again, Haga. If we cause harm to them, we cause harm to society, us. By assessing structural background conditions, again, the structural complicity, understanding of the likes of Young and others, we focus on more forward than backward looking thinking. And therefore we shift away from casting victims or survivors, but in fact, in the logic of the drama triangle versus empowerment triangle, which is another sort of psychology thinking prop, we cast creators. Another intuition is that of embracing our interdependence. And here I close, realizing that the unfreedom of some is an unfreedom of all, but also then realizing that taking very seriously centering mutual aids and an intuition towards solidarity. None of us are pure. We are all part of these systems, regularly asking ourselves, what part of the problem do we own? Envisioning accountability, I cannot but close with Adrienne Maree Brown, who says many things that are so relevant, but in relation to the solutionism, thinking around decentralizing our idea of where solutions and decisions happen, where ideas come from, which of course aligns with their idea of collective visioning and generative change, in which radical imagination is harnessed by social and political movements. I think these are comments that both Lorraine and Kim, you were making in relation to who should be driving, but then how in these processes, and that law is mobilized in the service of solidarity. Or again, as Young puts it, taking seriously our connectedness and discharging our collective responsibility by responding to systems of oppression through solidarity, mutual aid, and so forth, and radical reimagination. So I'll stop here also because I need a drink of water, but I'm really excited to keep going on those threads and hearing from you.
Can I respond to Valentina first, just a brief second? Thank you for that. And I feel so grateful in particular because I feel like you were able to take what I was trying to say and put it in a much, just a really beautiful and thoughtful theoretical framework, which I'm not very good at. So thanks, Valentina. And I was thinking, listening to you, and then also reflecting on earlier comments too, about how one thing maybe I want to think through more is how intersectionality itself is, I think, inherently neutral in a way, in that we think, and it's important, and we think of the positive aspects of it, but actually it is also a call to look very transparently at the ways that what we bring as actors. We have our own intersectionality, which is linked to our inherent biases about how we do this work too, right? And so we have to be aware of sort of the ways that intersectionality explains some of the the less positive aspects or flaws in our own system and our own work. So I was thinking about the way that sometimes any of us who have worked through interpreters for a small linguistic group, right? We know that there's inherent bias when we have an interpreter in the mix, and we rely so much on their ability to be vessels of language, but of course they bring their own, political identities, whatever, cultural positionalities or relationships and dynamics, social and class dynamics, gender dynamics, vis-a-vis the person that they're trying to interpret for. And so being aware of the ways that may happen and affect and have things flow downstream, but also our inability to understand the fullness of everybody in the system, even the more invisible parts of it. We don't think about interpreters enough and how we're using them. And it's just a tiny micro example, but just where you were mentioning, Valentina, about how we are all intersectional in the way we work, and being aware of that in ourselves and others, and where it might be limiting actually, or help obscure things instead of always illuminating things might be useful. It's just one.
Valentina was so eloquent that none of us know what to say now. But yes, you know, you brought so much to the table that really I'm just kind of sitting and thinking, okay, I want to replay this conversation and download the transcript and, you know, think about this a lot more deeply afterwards. So, you know, I'm just going to say thank you for bringing your reflection in. And then you used the word that I did not use that I love. You know, you talked about pluriversality, and yeah, so just thank you for that reflection.
One memory that came to me as you were speaking, Valentina, and I like that the way you kind of blew open the conversation again, to say, okay, what are we even talking about? Why are we, can criminal justice be truly intersectional is kind of the question that I asked myself after listening to you. And I was thinking about, you know, working on these universal jurisdiction cases and, you know, trying to make the process as inclusive and intersectional as possible as I was interviewing people and building partnerships, etc. But then entering a system that I no longer control, not that I was really in control before, but as soon as the case is filed, and then there is the system, which in a way is violent. I don't think there's many countries where the criminal justice system doesn't have an aspect of violence to it, and sometimes it's very violent. And then the person who was being prosecuted is a person in all of the cases that I worked on who traditionally is somebody who's discriminated by that system. Whether or not they did what we allege they did is not relevant at that moment, but you know, they were somebody who had come to that country as a refugee, who had already experienced that system as violent, and who was now again experiencing the violence of that system. And then suddenly I was a little actor in this machine, and I had no control anymore about whether anybody was thinking about what does this mean structurally, what is the colonial history of the country who's bringing these cases. So it made me reflect on to what extent, when we engage with a state system and a criminal system, to what extent we can make that intersectional, because at some point things are out of our hands. And also, we are not, if we're thinking about prosecution strategies, first of all, in those cases, I was not the prosecutor, but even when we are, to what extent can our prosecution strategy at least reflect that we're looking at bigger structural issues and not just going for the mid-level perpetrator because he's right outside of our doorstep. So just some more thoughts. Like I said in the beginning, we're not going to have a conclusion here, but just more food for thoughts. And yeah, if anybody else has something to say, please go ahead. I'm going to have a look.
Yeah, so like one thing that Valentina reminded me of, right? I've had this, because I have actually been like thinking and talking and about this design principle abolition, right? And so I had to think about where do we use this type of language, you know, and we are normally talking about abolish the police or abolish, you know, where are we using it in 2022? So we're normally talking about abolishing systems that cause harm, like maybe policing or prisons, or, and so I started this kind of, again, like speculative design work of, okay, so can we be creating new systems that are addressing these issues related to care, related to feeling, healing, related to relationships. And the reality is maybe we can't, you know, so, but I've been, this is my design process where I'm thinking, okay, is there any way at all to, I don't even want to use the word reform because reform is linked to incremental change, right? But is there any way to propose new systems in this space? I'll have to say the space that you all are operating in, you know, criminal justice, that are not based on harm or not, you know, I don't know if there are ways of bringing in new epistemologies and ideologies into this work that are around more restorative practices and less punitive and harmful practices.
I didn't even dare to come in because there's too much to unpack with what you said, Valentina, except that I am been mulling over quite a bit what you said about, you know, how we ensure that the voices, I can't remember the name of that last quote, but I absolutely loved it. The person you quoted last, and it was really interesting for me because of looking at this from the victim perspective, and just trying to get a sense of how we ensure that some of the narratives around structures, around accountability, that some of the other voices are included in that, or are we going in accepting systems as they are, which links back to what Lesley-Ann said. I don't know. I honestly don't know. This is one of these sessions where I think we're envisioning a future, but we're left with more questions than answers, which is, I suppose, a design thing. When you don't have all the answers, then I guess you can creatively design.
Sorry, 2022, and I still sometimes stay on mute. There's one question from the chat that might be interesting for us to think about, because right now we're kind of being asked, or we ask each other to think outside of the box, whatever that means. And there was a question in the chat around speculative design, and it seems to open us up to being creative and visionary, and lawyers are very rarely seen or encouraged to be creative. And the question is if there are any suggestions among the panel for how to encourage that creativity in colleagues and students.
I put something into the chat which I can say for the recording, right? So, you know, how we deal with this in design is that we are actively forcing students to consider many different frames, you know, both when they are framing the question and as they're coming up with solutions. So like, you know, in another discipline, they might be working towards one solution, but that's not how we work in design. You know, if the student comes back with one solution, that's not creativity, right? The definition of creativity is when you are seeing many different solutions to this. Well, one, you are framing the issue in many different ways, and then you're choosing the right framing, and then still coming up with many different solutions to that frame that you've chosen. So that a student in one of my classes might have to come up with a solution that is a policy, a product, an app, and you know, and they have to come up with all of these different solutions in the brainstorming, and that's what gets them to a place of innovation, the fact that they've considered so many different things. So I don't know if in the space that you operate in law, if it's possible to reframe issues many different times and think of many different options as a solution. And that's what could promote creativity. And then I put in the chat also that I've actually done like a few design sprints with lawyers. Well, one, I collaborated with one lawyer. We co-taught a design class that was like a hair pulling experience. And then I've worked with lawyers in design sprints, you know, and so yeah, lawyers can be creative. Everyone can be creative, and you just need some support to get there.
I was thinking in terms of students specifically, just to pick up on Lesley-Ann, I think for law students in particular, creativity starts with humility, actually, because there's a tendency, I think, among a lot of law students who are very bright, to assume that we have all the answers, we understand the problem fully. And so just starting every class I've ever taught was just reminding folks to be humble about our space in the solution making, and then what we don't know, what we can't do, where we have to go for other information and understanding. And so my syllabi are, you know, often packed with public health reading, social work reading, reading from psychology, history, also to give us a fuller understanding of the crimes that we're even talking about. We can't actually start with solutioning, right, until we understand everything we can about the experience of the people we care about. And so I think cross-training a little bit in terms of what we assign, but then also when we have the opportunity to travel, making sure that we speak to colleagues from different walks of life, right? Not just other lawyers and judges, right? But everybody, like the folks who are in the healthcare system, the folks who provide counseling, the folks who have that small community organization for women's rights or whatever it might be. So I think there is, when you have the luxury of actual physical exposure to a place. We visit the courtroom, we look at the design of the courtroom, actually, Lesley-Ann, and we think about how intimidating it must be for an Indigenous person to walk in and testify there, right? But then we also visit hospitals, we visit prisons, we try to see all of the spaces and understand, wow, this is what it actually looks like, and this is how the justice process is inhibited or enabled, right? It is very much in the places people stand physically, right? So that's just one thought there.
It reminds me of the last webinar where Marina McCollum from the Trauma-Informed Lawyer podcast encouraged all lawyers to say, I don't know, at least once a day. Because it's true, we're being taught that we kind of have to have all the answers. And one of our greatest skills, I think, is to pretend that we know even when we don't. And there's so much learning that is lost when we feel like we have to posture that way. It also makes me think about the need to just change legal education and how elitist it still is, and how so many questions might never be asked, because a lot of different perspectives never even make it to the legal profession. Lorraine.
I'm just gonna be quick. I saw a quote from, or a message from Kim about, transitional justice. I think you were talking about, yes, finding a more meaningful way that traditional justice systems and formal justice, international justice systems can not just coexist, but interact and complement and be enriched by each other. And I think that is absolutely the direction that we have to go in. But I have to say, when I think about what Valentina said, is that increasingly I genuinely ask myself, how is that even possible? Like, we're seeing strides, we're seeing steps in that direction, but really unpacking what each thing means for the different actors. And I'm talking now, looking at it from the perspective of even victims and affected communities. I mean, our concepts of international justice and what we think international justice is quite often very different from how they see it. And they might prioritize, for example, traditional justice. And we don't even think that is justice when we're talking about atrocity crimes sometimes, you know what I mean? So it's, as part of this envisioning, it would be interesting to see whether it means, do we borrow from some systems to inform others? Do we, when we're talking about complementarity, what does that mean? Does that mean a handing down from these formal justice structures to domestic systems, or a sharing up? So I am really, I agree with you, but I'm just really thinking about from a pragmatic and really practical way, how do we move into that stage where we operationalize that? And I know that strides are being made through training, through collaboration, through multidisciplinary approaches to training. But I'm still left thinking about how we can make that more real, like, move it beyond where we are today in a very real way.
I do think, Lorraine, that is, I wish we had time, maybe Lesley, you and Lisa, you can arrange another conversation about exactly that. But I will say, situations, population-based surveys about priorities, just right, and want to enter a criminal justice system, and not everyone does, right? So there's diversity in what people want, even within an individual community that's been affected by conflict. And so I suppose that while we want to build that synergy between the traditional and formal systems, there are folks who just want to enter a formal system as they understand it. And for that, we have to make that work as best as we can for them. They may be a minority in some situations, but if we do believe in diversity of people's priorities for justice and understandings of it, then all of the mechanisms, all the avenues have to be made to work well for them and take intersectionality into account. So I guess it's a couple of different things, right? We want systems to speak with each other, but then they also do have to stand. I don't think, if we at least look at the data we have, that there's a conflict affected community in the world where there's no one who doesn't want who wants to go to court, right? So yeah, that's what I would say there, I think.
I think those were beautiful closing remarks, reminding us of the diversity in perceptions of what justice even means, and the need to make all of the pathways work as well as we can. I want to thank you all for your openness, for your willingness to think through different shapes that the future could take, and for embracing this conversation with such humility and for bringing your wisdom. I think all of us have learned a lot from all of you. Since this is our last webinar, I also want to thank the organizing partners, the Transitional Justice Institute at Ulster University, and the Unit for Global Justice at Goldsmiths University for their support for this webinar throughout the series. Thanks to all facilitators, discussants who have joined. Some of you have joined several times. Everybody who came and uplifted this series on social media and spread the word. You can find all of the recordings on our YouTube channel. We also now have a website for the Emergent Justice Collective that has just gone live. We will add more information. You can sign up for our emailing list and stay up to date. We hope to have follow-up discussions and to continue this conversation. And yeah, thank you all so much. And I don't want to keep you for longer, but I would like to talk to you for many hours, but I don't think we have time. Thank you, everyone.